Gentlemen, it's been an interesting 48 hours. We have had what? States get called and then get called back. We have states like Alaska that don't seem to have that many voters and still can't seem to call the election. We've had 2 years of campaigning that we don't really know what to make of it. I think it's an interesting conversation today to have. What is the future of elections as we move forward? Jump in.
Go.
Wide open question there, isn't it?
Yeah,
and I've seen everything in the last 48 hours, on social media, from the young lady that's like, why should Wyoming have such a voice in this election? It's just unfair, that we really just need to look at Los Angeles and New York and then let that handle. It's this argument that has been going on here for a very long time. And it's amazing at times how, and I'm not going to say stupid, but ignorant, they just don't know, what the system is. And we've pushed so hard to have people be involved in our elections. And you sit back at times and say, is that really such a good idea?
That's true. I mean, in fact, maybe it's a good thing here to do a little kind of overview of why it is that we do not have a national popular vote, and why is that, and why do we have 51 individual elections, 50 states, and the District of Columbia, 57 if you're Barack Obama. Hey, Dave, I just thought of something. Maybe as our host, you want to introduce who's up here with us today? This is a little unusual. Usually it's just you and I talking, and we just go and we riff. But we've got the rest of this motley crew up here. Who are these guys?
Well, for those of you who haven't met Jeff Jensen and Alan Thomas, Jeff is the president of the Alexander Hamilton chapter number 4 up in northern Colorado, and Alan Thomas is the docent of Admiral David Farragut, chapter number 1. 2 people who Tom and I have both known for quite a while, and people we thought could bring a really interesting perspective. We've had the opportunity over the last several months as we've developed the Vino Veritas Society. We've also had the opportunity over the last several years as we've gotten to know these guys to listen to their insight. And we thought with the election being so recent, as I said in the email that went out, for those of you who didn't see it and are watching this later on record, we usually record our podcasts a day or 2 in advance. We produce them. You see the multiple camera angles. We have a producer who's going through all of it. What ends up happening is when we do that, it didn't really make sense because we knew we would be so far from knowing so many things, or if we had recorded Tuesday, it would have been before the election ever happened. And it wouldn't make sense. So we decided today for this just one-time special occasion, we were going to record our podcast live. We were going to invite, like I said, Alan and Jeff to come join us and talk a little bit about what their perspective on the election was, both personally and from the branding perspective of the Vino Veritas Society. And as we do that, I think our goal is not just to sit here and worry about what was the result of this election, what just happened, but also talk about what does this mean for elections going forward? What does this mean for elections as we work into the future, and looking at how the electorate is continuing to change and evolve.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good sort of starting point.
So what I was going to do is get us going kind of with a big overview and summary of why things are the way that they are, why are they designed, why are we waiting for individual states, right? We're sitting here waiting for results from Nevada and Pennsylvania and Georgia, and a whole lot of Americans think this is ridiculous. Why don't we just have a national vote? Mm-hmm. Why does this matter? Why does so much hinge on particular votes or particular states? And it really goes back to the overriding theme that came out of the American Revolution and the American founding. You see this prominently in the Federalist Papers, but also in much of the literature. And that is on the one hand, any kind of legitimate government absolutely requires the consent of the governed. You have to have the consent of the governed because all men are created equal, because every human being has a natural right to their own liberty. No human being has a natural authority to rule over someone else. So you need permission if you're going to do any kind of ruling at all. And at the same time, here's the rub. Human beings in big groups tend to do stupid things. Mobs tend not to be very good at reasoning, at making wise choices. And there's the conflict. How do you get the consent of the governed, which is necessary, and try to minimize the damage done by large mobs of people? And the whole Constitution is designed with that goal in mind, and especially the way we select presidents. The original idea of the Electoral College was that in each state there would be a relatively small number of electors, and the original vision was those electors would actually sit down, just like we are. They would sit at a table together, 5, 10, 20 people in a room, and they would discuss, hey, who do you guys think we should vote for, right? And they would debate and talk about the pros and cons in a very cool, calm, deliberative way. And then those electors would cast their vote from their state, and all the other electors in the other states would follow suit.
Dare I say a well-reasoned perspective?
A well-reasoned. And then you also had sort of a bigger design feature, and that is different groups of people in different states, in different parts of the country, have different kind of interests. They have different lifestyles. They have different businesses and industries. So the idea was, instead of one big national vote, which would be heavily skewed by heavily populated areas, let's have a system where a successful presidential campaign has to appeal to different interests in different parts of the country, different states, which tends to moderate presidential platforms. It tends to make them more reasonable, which is less extreme, which is why we want this system. I'll also add out here, just to get us going, right before we launched, my friend Rob Nadelson passed through, and Rob, I am hereby designating Rob as a friend of the Vino Veritas Society. Okay. And he reminded me of something important, and that is in Article 2 of the Constitution. It actually grants to Congress the power to determine the time when the electors are chosen and the day of when the electors actually cast their ballot for who's going to be president. And the whole purpose of that was to avoid a long, drawn-out election, because when elections get drawn out over many days, weeks, or months, it encourages corruption. It incentivizes. If elections start dragging on for weeks, that's when you get these situations where someone says, oh, we're 3,000 votes short. Can we find a box of 3,000 votes in the closet back there? Right? These kinds of things happen as they get drawn out. The idea was have people show up, cast their votes, and then the election is over, and count them. The more compact and compressed an election is in time, the less opportunities there are for corruption. The more drawn out it is, the more. And I think this is one of the things, Congress has actually passed federal legislation about this, and states have been ignoring it for decades. When they send out their ballots weeks in advance, and they give, citizens have weeks or months of opportunities to send in ballots and these things. I think this is something that needs to be tweaked at the federal level, of tightening up when these elections actually happen.
You bring up a point that I'd like to ask you. Several months ago, we did, as our case study for Vino Veritas Society, mob rule.
Right.
And you brought this up as a point. When we have 80, 90% voter turnout, how is that not mob rule?
Right. Well, in many cases, it can be, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges. Keep in mind, this is one of those this is a hard truth. This is a hard truth, I think, for many Americans to accept. It's one of these things we in the Vino Veritas Society, we're an unusual group, and yet we need to confront this hard truth. And it goes back to what I was talking about, that tension between government by consent on the one hand, you need the consent, and the fact that people in large numbers often do really stupid, unwise, foolish things. When you look at the design of the original Constitution, remember even the Senate, members of the Senate were not directly elected by the people. There was only one part of the national government, the House of Representatives. That was the only part for which citizens voted directly. And even then, right, it was not a national vote. It was, we divided the country into a bunch of congressional districts, and the citizens in one district would vote for their one representative in their district. All the other part, right, members of the Senate, the president in the White House, members of the judicial branch, the federal judiciary, all of them were selected indirectly without the citizens directly voting for them.
And I think that kind of plays into very good branding by progressives. I mean, what did we see branded across Fox News, CNN? Democracy 2020, right? Yep. They've really wanted to say we're a democracy where we should vote for everything. And we have really failed to convey the point that the founders believed that was a very bad idea. Whenever they talked about democracy, it was not a good thing.
Right.
And we've missed this opportunity to say, we don't want a democracy. Because when we have democracy, it's the example used in this case study with the two wolves and a lamb. Who's gonna get eaten for lunch? You know, it's gonna be the lamb. We don't want that. We want the republic that we have, but we've failed miserably to wrangle in this idea that democracy is a good and brilliant thing, like it's been portrayed in our school system and all across the media right now.
Yeah, in fact, since I'm on this theme of drawing out contrasts, I'll draw out another contrast, right? There's democracy. The principle of democracy is that the majority does whatever they want to the minority. That is democracy. And then there is the proper purpose of government. There's an actual constitutional republic, the purpose of which is to protect the equal rights of all citizens. These are not the same thing. And the more you lean towards pure democracy, the more you lean towards the voting majority doing whatever they want to those in the minority, including restricting their liberty, taking their money, making those in the minority pay for all the programs people, the majority of voters want to pay for. Aristotle had this interesting idea in his book on the politics. He looked at these various regime forms, and all of them in their pure form, a pure monarchy, a pure democracy, a pure aristocracy, they all have problems inherent in them, and they all lead to instability and often revolution. And so what he suggested was a kind of blended regime where you have parts of the government that are more democratic, parts of the government that are more aristocratic, right? And you weave it together, and that's exactly what the founders did, right? The Supreme Court is clearly less democratic than the House of Representatives, right? And yet they're all part of one government. So we have this wise blending of regime forms within the Constitution. And the challenge is most of our fellow citizens don't have the kind of classical, broad, liberal education, right, to really appreciate the brilliance, the genius of that design. And so these slogans for more democracy carries a lot of weight with tens of millions of voters.
It makes you think that if our founders were looking at this and looking back at all this and seeing how far we've moved towards that democracy, they're sitting there laughing. They're saying, see, we did this for a reason. This wasn't just, this wasn't because, I mean, you hear the argument all the time, right? Oh, they only put those things in place because it was hard to travel, right? They would make up these excuses of, oh, we didn't have direct democracy because it was hard to travel and hard to communicate with each other. No, they saw this. They would be looking at these legal challenges and these every vote has to count and having to have multiple people sitting around every single vote counter trying to make sure that was that vote properly counted? Was that vote a legitimate vote? Should we be counting that vote? And I'm sitting there thinking they had this all solved 244 years ago. And we have made it so much harder on ourselves. And I also couldn't help but thinking, as I'm thinking about, there was a press conference, Pam Bondi this morning from the Trump campaign. They got a court injunction in Pennsylvania to allow that the courts were not, that the vote counters were not allowing the campaign in to watch each of the vote counters to make sure that the votes were correct. And when they were allowing them in, they were requiring a 30-foot distance. They had to stand 30 feet away from the vote counter because of COVID. So the judge says, no, you can go in and you can have 6 feet. Imagine if we had more than 2 parties that were really in this.
Right.
Could you imagine a 10-party system like you have in some of these other countries, and you have 10 people around each and every vote counter? It'd be a football stadium.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you actually execute that? And it just goes to show we keep pushing this idea and reminding people the founders actually had some good ideas. They actually knew what they were talking about. They thought through these things. These weren't ideas that they came up with on a whim.
Well, in fact, that's an important point for critics of, in fact, both for critics of the Electoral College as well as cheerleaders today of the Electoral College. It's important to recognize that the process we have in place right now is not the process envisioned by the founders. It's something very different. We have today, a majority of the states have state laws that bind the electors from that state, right? It says you must, and many states have a penalty attached to it. Like you can get fined $1,000 or something if you're an elector and you don't cast your ballot the way you're supposed to. And these same laws typically authorize a Secretary of State to dismiss or throw away an elector's vote that wasn't given the way that state law says it's supposed to be. Now, that whole process, right, where citizens of a state go vote, and then the state has a law that says, you electors, you shall cast your vote for whichever candidate won the most popular votes. That's a far cry from what the founders envisioned as the Electoral College.
I can't help but wrestle with the fact that the core of this argument is what you said, Tom, consent, right? Because as a representative republic in a fair and legitimate election, we elect someone to represent us. Yet we as voters for years have said, okay, we elect you. Oh, never mind. We're going to bring this back and we're going to keep this process for ourselves, initiatives and propositions and those types of things. And we're going to continue to push towards direct democracy because, yes, you're elected to represent me, but I don't trust you to do that, so we're going to bring this back. That idea of consent is really, to me, the core issue of the confusion of what we're really supposed to do as electors, as voters. And then we direct them, and then we have the power of revolution and the vote next time. But we've lost track of that.
It's absolutely true. In fact, those processes, like the initiative process, the direct democracy kind of processes we have today, those are innovations. To no one's surprise here, those are innovations by progressive thinkers 130, 120 years ago. That was not part, like if you look in the original Constitution, there's no process for an initiative to be put on a ballot, right? The whole idea was, it was twofold. Number one, we're going to be a representative republic. So the many elect a handful of representatives, and then they go so that they can actually sit in a room like we are and talk and think and debate in an environment of cool, calm deliberation. And number two, more importantly, we limited their power. So no matter what they're debating, deliberating about, no matter how reasonable and cool and calm they are, they have this much power. They only have the few constitutional powers that we gave them. What happens when you open up the door to direct initiative measures, now all of a sudden you get these measures. And this happens all the time. We put these measures on the ballot that effectively say, we're going to take your money away from you. We're going to make you pay for this program we want, or we're going to tell you how to run your business. We had a measure here in Colorado that passed of all this family medical leave time that is going to, think of the challenge of a small business in normal times, but especially in 2020 with government shutting everything. There are small businesses that have been crippled. There are already many that have closed. There are others that are on the verge of closing. They can barely pay their bills. And now you have a bunch of electors who don't know anything about my business, and they pass a measure saying, you shall offer all these benefits, and you're going to hire these other people if someone needs to take this family medical leave.
And I think we're, especially in Colorado here, we're seeing the very direct effects of that. I mean, a lot of these propositions and measures failed in our Republican form of government. They weren't able to push it through with the governor, with the Senate, and with the House, and instead they get enough signatures put on the ballot and hopefully, use enough fear or use enough just want. I mean, these are just like things like, oh, I would like to have paid family medical leave. Wouldn't you like that? Here,
Right.
Why don't you vote on it? And so there's
over and over
Yeah.
again of the woman whose son is dying of cancer, and saying it felt like I was watching one of those ASPCA commercials that want to bring everybody to tears every time you watch those ASPCA commercials. And she's sitting there saying, wouldn't you just give a couple dollars extra a month so that I can be with my son for his last breath?
Right.
But that's the danger of democracy, right? It's
Exactly.
because that's the danger of mobs, to tie this all in with what you were saying. Mobs are very easily swayed, and they're very easily swayed by passion and emotions. And when we ascribe to this democracy aspect, what we're essentially doing is handing all of our elections over to mobs and not to reason.
So if we're going to do that's the progressive model, right? We're gonna rally mobs. We're gonna have a leader who can rally the mob and get them to approve anything through direct democracy, and we're going to get a Supreme Court that's going to rubber stamp everything.
Dave, let me before you go on, let me inject something here,
Sure.
Because this is a really fascinating story. It was invented by progressives, and that was that initiative process, that form of direct democracy, was quite popular until the 1970s. Since which time it has been really popular among conservatives. Out in California in 1978, there was an initiative, Prop 13, that's right, launched by Howard Jarvis and a group of citizens out in California that were tired of their property taxes going through the roof. And so they rallied, they used the initiative process for the first time ever for a conservative end, a conservative goal. They passed Prop 13, which it limits the amount that local governments can increase property taxes. What was happening in California, you had little old ladies, widows, who had lived in the same house for 60 years. The house had been paid off for decades, and they were losing their homes because they couldn't pay the taxes. The property taxes kept going up and up and up. So Howard Jarvis and his group, they passed this. It launches a tax revolt out of California, of all places, that leads to Ronald Reagan getting elected in 1980. So you have these groups of conservatives in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s who are thinking, this is great, these initiative measures.
Well, Tabor here in 92.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Tabor is an extension of that whole movement. Now, I lived in California for 15 years, and I gave several addresses to these Howard Jarvis groups, and I challenged them. And here was my challenge. So it is true that they passed Prop 13. They did limit how much municipalities could raise property tax. And you know what the result was in California? California created over 5,000 new taxing entities. I would look at these groups of these conservative, fans of Howard Jarvis. I'd say, can anyone here tell me that government's gotten smaller in California since Prop 13? What has happened? What has happened to state spending? What has happened to the size of the state and county and local governments? The answer, it all increased. They just found literally, I went and I added it up at one time. I used to have a list. It's somewhere on my computer. There's approximately just short of 5,000 entities, government entities in California that have the power of taxation, that can take your money from you. And so they just went and taxed everything other than property taxes, right? And here's the problem with direct democracy. You put one thing on the table, that appeals to a certain group and say, isn't this great? Or maybe it's to prohibit something terrible. Isn't this terrible? And they get right whipped up with passion and enthusiasm. We got to pass this. And what they don't understand is how this is connected to 1,000 other subjects. And that's part of the art of legislation. That's part of the art of representing constituents, is to say, okay, we have all these things to consider, not just this one topic that's the hot topic, right? And it tends to be a really bad way of legislating, putting one hot topic on an initiative measure, getting it passed, and then it doesn't address all the other things that are on the table for those in government.
Well, and I think that speaks to a larger issue that Vino Veritas Society is trying to address as well, is these ballot issues aren't cultural shortcuts to what we need. One instance is the late-term abortion that failed here in Colorado. It was something, abortion bills have been put together in the House and in the Senate by Republicans for as long as I can remember, and they never get passed. And so we put this proposition here to try and shortcut culture and trying to shortcut what we wanted politicians to do, not realizing politicians are downstream of culture. The reason none of this has had any momentum is because we failed in the culture war in Colorado specifically and across the country. And we're trying to bypass what we need to be doing, influencing, changing hearts and minds of people. And we're trying to do that through the ballot box. And we need to realize the ballot box is not a place to change people's hearts and minds or their opinions about the country or about policy. All that work has to happen now through when we cast ballots.
Yeah.
And we're getting lazy as influencers by trying to just say, here's a good idea, here's a good policy, let's vote for it, as opposed to saying, we need to be influencing that so that people are going to their legislators and their representatives and saying, you know what, there's so much momentum behind this that if you don't do this, you're going to get thrown out.
I just want to second, it's a great point you're making, Alan, and I want to second it and put it in the context of what we're trying to do in the Vino and Veritas Society. It is more important that our members influence and persuade and inspire a few of their friends, maybe some family members, maybe some of you have, right? Some of us have smaller spheres of influence, some of us have larger, whatever your sphere of influence is, influence and inspire some people within your sphere. That's more important than getting the right measure on the ballot next time. Or it's even more important than getting this guy elected to the state house or this person elected to Congress, because they won't be able to do much if the culture remains the same. If we keep this progressive culture, they're not going to be able to do much in the service of constitutional government.
Well, let's talk about what that culture is. And that's where I was heading to earlier, and I'm so glad Alan brought it up. The culture has been evolving over time. And it's interesting. I know I use that word in a context when we're talking about progressivism and constitutionality and self-government, but we have been moving, as you've described, towards a less constitutional, less self-governing country, and more towards some version of progressivism, right? Tom, you and I talk about it all the time. We are more progressive today than we ever have been in our country's history. And what I think this election, and I'd love us to spend the rest of the time kind of exploring the idea of what does this election mean for the future? And I'm going to propose something for us to discuss. For years, we talked about politics as a two-dimensional plane, right? We said you're either, I think with the camera, you're either far to the right, you're far to the left. And then, or you're somewhere in between, right? And as a country, for years, I'd say up until probably the 50s or 60s, we were a right of center country, even a little bit in the 80s. I think that's moved quite a bit. But then around 2000, maybe a little bit before, sometime during the Clinton years, we left that two-dimensional plane altogether, and we ended up turning into this scatter graph of tribes. Progressivism breeds tribalism, right? And so it started to become, to get elected, you had to build a coalition of tribes. and tribes were based on single issues, single priorities. And even as conservatives, we talk about constantly. As conservatives, we always say, I am for small government. I don't want government involvement, except for that one thing, right? There's always that one thing that
Prop 13.
exactly. There's always that one thing that you say, but I want government control over that. And what you have to do is, as a candidate to get elected or to get a ballot measure passed, is you have to build a coalition of these tribes. I think we actually may have blown up the tribal system in the last 48 hours. And I think we are now down to a binary choice. I think we have seen more in the last year. I have seen more "Don't Tread on Me" flags flown in this country than maybe ever before, even during the time of the revolution, right? I mean, you just think about how many more people there are.
Right.
I see "Don't Tread on Me" flags everywhere. On my way over here this morning, I was driving past a homeless encampment right on Grant Street in Denver, and one of the tents had a flagpole with a "Don't Tread on Me" flag and a pirate flag hanging from it. And I almost wanted to go over and just say,
I'm not sure what to
explain
make
that.
Right.
Like, tell me, but there is a trend towards, I just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
The government has overstepped and overstepped and overstepped and overstepped. And now we're starting to get to the point where this isn't constitutional anymore. We're so far from the constitutional design of this country. And I think we've become we're going to be going forward as a binary choice.
Well, and I'm going to put a little edge on what you just said, because you do have people who want some constitutional constraints on government power, even if they don't fully understand what that means. They just know they don't like government in their face, in their business, in their family life, in their checkbook or checking account, right? And on the other side, there's a growing body of people who say, if you dare utter the word Constitution, you are a racist. You are a despicable, immoral human being if you mention it, right? Much less if you actually talk about it or know it or study it.
Or pull it out of your.
Or pull it.
And if anybody needs confirmation of that, just go read Ed Markey,
Yeah.
Ed Markey's Twitter feed, who got reelected this week. Ed Markey in Boston, or in Massachusetts, I don't know what his district is, but Ed Markey in Massachusetts posts on Twitter, the Constitution is racist, the Constitution is sexist, the Constitution is xenophobic, and he gets reelected. So that's the exact binary choice I think we've reached.
I'm gonna. Sometimes you rephrase this, but in my mind, when we distill it down to its elements, it is constitutional self-government. We make our choices about how to live, or it is progressive central planning. Some body of experts somewhere is going to tell you how to run your business, how to use your property, how to raise your kids, what health care you're going to have, all the details of your life.
And I would make the argument that for anybody out there, as you start to think about this, and then I'd love for you guys to jump in and kind of break down what you think of my analysis on this. But for anybody out there who is sitting there saying, but this is really important to me, but that is really important to me, the conservatives out there who have that one thing, there's always that one thing. Can any of that exist without constitutional self-government? Can you have religious liberty without constitutional self-government? Can you homeschool or private school your children without constitutional self-government? School choice, all of these little things that make you that's your one priority. Can you have the right to get married as a gay man or woman? Or can you have the right to adopt as a gay man or woman? All of these big questions. People have different opinions on all of those things, but at one point we have to just say, if the government tries to solve that, they're going to try to solve it for everybody, and it's not going to end up well for anyone.
When I was teaching at Hillsdale College, I was also I always had one foot in the classroom and one foot in the fundraising department. I would go with the development team, raise money, and we did raise a lot of money to build to the credit of Hillsdale College, they built, you know what they built on their campus? A shooting range. Let that sink in. There's a shooting range on the campus, and you know, at almost every college, you got to take a few PE credits as a student. You can take a class, right, on the Constitution and the right to bear arms, and you can go out onto the shooting range and actually shoot. Well, I was there with Larry Arnn and several others, and we had people at the table who were gun manufacturers. We had a representative from the NRA, from the National Rifle Association, those types. And they were talking about the importance of the Second Amendment. Everything was focused on the Second Amendment. And at one point I asked them a question. I said, do you think we can keep the Second Amendment if we lose the Constitution? I said, why don't you guys talk about preserving the entire Constitution, the whole constitutional structure of government? The Second Amendment is a piece of that. It's a part of that. It's not this standalone thing, you know, to save. And I think that's, to your point, the parts of freedom that some Americans like, that some conservatives like, or free marketeers, whatever they are, they would really be well served to help preserve the entire constitutional republic rather than focusing on the one policy that they're interested in.
Dave, you bring up a point about there's a lot of people out there that just say, just leave me alone, right? I don't know that those people that I know that say, just leave me alone, really fully understand what that means, because there's confusion in what does it mean to be self-governing? The progressive movement has moved us so far away from understanding what it means to be self-governing. Should we really be looking at teaching how to self-govern?
I think that's absolutely right. When you have citizens who are motivated, inspired, they have a love for taking care of themselves and taking care of their families. They want to govern themselves. Those kinds of citizens, they don't want much from government. They don't want a bunch of regulations wrapped all over their business. They don't want government bureaucrats coming into their bank account and taking a bunch of money to pay for a bunch of wasteful programs. They want to live their own lives, but they have to feel comfortable, confident that they can live their lives. I mean, this is one of the most corrosive effects of the progressive movement, which now stretches back 150 years, is teaching Americans, especially young Americans, you're not going to make it on your own. You're not. You need us to take care of your health care. You need us to take care of your housing. You need us to take care of all these areas. And there are now generations who grow up thinking, well, I can't make these decisions on my own. I can't take care of myself.
It goes further than that. Forget just taking care of yourself. You mentioned, I need people taking care of my housing, my education, this and that. The common concept, the common understanding is that we wouldn't have anything if it wasn't for government.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have roads. That's the first argument you always hear, right? Mm-hmm. That if government didn't exist and if government didn't tax us, there'd be no roads.
Right.
Forget the fact that our roads, I mean, Colorado especially, I can't tell you how many friends have had to make insurance claims over potholes that have destroyed their car. But
by the way, I've got to give a shout out to another one of our friends of the Vino Veritas Society, Bob Schaefer, who has come up with two glorious sound bites. One is no taxation without education. If you're going to tax us for schools, by golly, you better be running schools, right? You can't take our money and then shut down all the schools. And his other line is no taxation without transportation. If you're going to tax us for roads, then damn it, go fix the potholes in the roads.
Well, see, even Henry Ford, said, if I just did everything you wanted me to do, I'd just make faster horses.
Right. That's
right.
We just had that conversation in the last podcast.
It's like it doesn't compute, because there are people that are making the demands, but don't really understand what those demands mean. To your point about there's these 100 other things out here that are tied to that.
Right. So the fundamental idea here is that, to me, we need to put all of the policy things aside. For the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years, we need to put all the policy ideas aside. We need to put all of the worry about, Alan, you were talking about the abortion bills, this bill, that bill, and it needs to become about saving the Constitution and saving the Declaration, going back to the idea of the original U.S. Code and promoting the idea of self-government, because none of the things we're talking about, we have been losing over and over and over again for 75 years.
And that gets kind of the root of how we're going to be persuasive going forward about this. We appeal to the authority of the Constitution of the Founding Fathers, and we're starting to see that, to kind of back this up, as a Christian, if I came up to you and I said, I believe in the Bible, here's what it says to do, you should do it, and you're not a Christian, you're going to say, I don't believe in the Bible, why should I do it? Right. We have to get better at not being lazy and just appealing to the Constitution of the Founding Fathers. We have to understand these principles and the logic behind it and appeal to the very base principle of freedom and be persuasive that way, as opposed to saying the Founding Fathers said this, so we should believe it. Well, we're seeing that over half the country won't listen to that argument because they don't believe in the Constitution. We have to be able to say, you should believe in freedom because X, Y, and Z, not because I'm appealing to an authority, but because this is logical and this is reasonable. And if you believe in freedom, your life is going to be so much better. But that's harder. That's a lot more difficult than just saying, well, the Founding Fathers said so, so you should believe it. Right. Well, half the country, to your point, is saying, we think they're all racist. Right. So we need to be able to make the point and be educated enough ourselves in the principles to be able to make the point without once mentioning the Constitution or amendments or the Founding Fathers or any of this. We need to be able to make the case and the point and the arguments and the logic behind all of these foundational principles.
The hard truth is we are in an era, we're in a progressive era in which the mere mention of the Founding Fathers is now polarizing. That is like a lightning bolt hitting in the middle of a room. I've often asked people, I'll say, do you think you could teach Euclidean geometry without ever mentioning Euclid? Without ever talking about Euclid or his life or his interest, could you teach the principles of geometry? And I think most people say, well, yeah, I can explain what a trapezoid is and what a triangle is, and I don't have to refer to Euclid for those concepts because I get the concepts. That's what we need to do with the principles of liberty, not rely on the authority of the founders or their constitution, but help our fellow citizens understand why it's good for them. It's in their interest. They will get more out of life. They'll have more opportunities. They'll be happier if they are free and flourishing.
I'm going to be the dissenter a little bit on that comment. I like to be. I'm going to make the argument that when you're trying to make an argument for certain aspects of liberty, that's when you use the principle. But when you're not having a debate over a principle, when it's not about a principle, I think it's valuable to have conversations about what our founding fathers knew and how well this stuff was thought out and some of the great, amazing, incredible things that they thought about and did and how they came about doing that. Because I know I have convinced a lot of people who I've been able to change their perspective on some of this stuff. I mention the founding fathers when I'm not talking about the principles. When we're just having a normal conversation, Tom, we've talked about one of my favorite things in the world is George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island. And when I'm not in a scenario where I'm debating a policy or I'm debating liberty, and I can bring that up as part of a conversation, I remove some of that barrier for future conversations. And we do know that the founders were really smart, thoughtful, well-educated men and women too. I mean, it's not just, you look at somebody like Abigail Adams. It is not a bad thing to talk about our founders being positive. And I just want to make sure people don't think, okay, we should never mention the founding fathers again. Yeah, we should never mention any of them again.
It's part of reclaiming, right? Reclaiming that reputation and the credit that they deserved. One of the things that is often lost, we're so fixated on the topic of race and racial justice we tend to forget that a much larger problem, I don't want to dismiss or downplay in any way the horrific injustices of slavery, but in Europe and in North America, a much larger problem was religious persecution. Europe was dominated by Christian regimes, Christian armies of Christians slaughtering each other by the millions over questions like, does transubstantiation, you're right, is that real or not? Is Protestant a legitimate breakoff of the Catholic Church? Does the Pope have the authority to install or remove a king from a regime? All those kinds of theological questions were causes of enormous amounts of war and bloodshed and suffering. And these American founders sit there and they put their minds to work and they create the first ever regime of religious liberty where they said the laws are going to protect your rights because you're a citizen. And it does not matter what church you belong to. It doesn't matter if you don't belong to any church at all. The laws are still going to protect your property, your freedom. That had never been done and anywhere in all of human history. And you look at that and you think, wow, that's really impressive. Doesn't mean James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton were angels and perfect. No, they weren't. They were all mortal men, and they all did stupid things in their own ways. But the good things they did good things on a scale most of us not only do we never achieve, we can't even dream of achieving that sort of thing.
But to your point, absolutely, this begins with relationship. One of you said, talking to your brothers and your sisters and your mom and your dad and your neighbor, whatever. This absolutely begins with relationship. We don't have the authority to step into somebody's life and say, you should listen to me without that relationship. This is not a flash in the pan. It is not a, turn the page and now everything's going to be great and we're going to be able to talk about the Constitution and our founding fathers. We really need to focus on building the relationships, which is what the Vino and Veritas Society is really strives to do. And that's building these chapters where we build these relationships internally, where we can, in a safe manner, get together and have these conversations without the fear of being over dramatic, bloodied over it, right? And so at the very core, our founding fathers didn't get where they got because they were total strangers to each other that happened to walk into a room and say, okay, let's do this. It was really a small ragtag group of men who didn't have the majority of the country behind them at the time.
That's right.
They came together and said, we are willing to do something radical here.
Yeah. And
I think that's really at the core of who the Vino and Veritas Society is. It's why I've been honored to be asked to be a part of that is because that relationship is so critically important. And we talk about self-governance. You can't even self-govern unless you're in relation.
That's right.
You can't.
Yeah. And Dave,
social justice doesn't happen without justice.
Dave and I have talked about this from the beginning. When Vino and Veritas Society was still just an idea, before we'd even started before we'd formed any chapters, there are approximately a little less than 350 million Americans. We don't need 350 million members of the Vino and Veritas Society to preserve self-governing constitutional republicanism here in the United States. We don't even need 100 million. We need a few 100,000, a million members out there digging into the ideas, digging into the literature, inspiring others with the wonderful, beautiful story of America, the story of these people who, when you think of the very first colonists who came to North America, British North America in the early 1600s, think of what their life was like. Most of them were freezing to death and starving to death.
Yeah.
I mean, horrible things were happening. And they go from that to all of this beauty that we have created, all of this prosperity, all of this human happiness. It's an incredible story. If we have a minority of citizens who are part of our social club and they're out there spreading that inspirational message more rapidly than COVID. We're on the path to achieving our goal.
Alan just said it. I think these ideas do become infectious as you start to understand them. They start to captivate you. And
Founding Fathers pandemic.
Jeff, as you talked about the Founding Fathers, they did two things that I think our members need to think about. And if you invite anybody in, if you're coming to events, if you're doing anything as part of this organization, Founding Fathers did two things. One, they were developing civic knowledge, right? They didn't have the Constitution and the Declaration and all those things to go back and reference like we do. But they went back and they read Aristotle and Plato and Locke and Adam Smith and Shakespeare, right? They went through, they read the classics. But they became knowledgeable, and they became knowledgeable about civics and civic life and social life. I think we have to make sure we're doing that, and that's one of the main purposes. We try to make it a little bit easier by having things like videos and toolboxes and these sort of conversations. The second thing they did that you talked about that I want everybody to realize how important it really is, they developed trust. Right? Remember the last sentence of the Declaration of Independence.
And
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
And to that end, you don't just do that with somebody you just met on the street. That's why this is the Vino and Veritas Society. It's about learning, but it's also about building fun, friendly relationships with people you trust. And as we grow this, we will try to provide as many opportunities as we can for people to get to know each other, to meet, to spend time together, to start to trust each other.
And we're suggesting they drink wine together, too.
Well,
that's part of it.
What better way to become friends with somebody than over bread and wine?
Yeah.
Right? So
That's long-standing, by the way.
It's been proven over many centuries.
It wasn't the last meeting, it was the Last Supper.
That's right.
Such a good point. So,
great.
So to that end, the other aspect of it that we have to remember is, and I brought this up at Alan's chapter meeting last night. We hear a lot of people very, very angry right now. There's a lot of people who they don't know what to make of things. They don't know what to do about how do we handle this, whether it's here in Colorado, whether it's on a national level. We don't know what's going to happen with the presidential election. And some people start to bring up the idea of revolution. And at the Vino Veritas Society, one of our 6 precepts is the right to revolution. Mm-hmm. Your elected official should always be afraid of citizens saying, no, you're not going to take that right away from me. And if you try, you're going to regret it. But at the same time, you have to have those other 2 aspects before you ever even consider going down that path. You have to have the civic knowledge to be able to sit and say, here's what you've done wrong to me. Here's how you've abused me. And here's why I'm saying no. Right. And why it's morally legitimate for me to say no. The other thing you have to be able to do is say, and I know I've got the trust in my fellow citizens, in my friends, in my family, and my neighbors who have also gained that same civic knowledge and understand that they're going to stand next to me, that they're going to be there with me, and this is not going to be me by myself.
Well, and let's be real clear here. I mean, these are heady times, and people are reaching in desperation, understandably. Also, revolution is a terrible and terrifying thing. It's nothing that anyone should go into easily. It's an absolute last-ditch resort measure when there is no other way. There's no other way to justice. And that means before reaching for revolution, you exhaust every other avenue, every other option you have. And one of the options that we still have available, we need to do everything that we can to make sure our fellow citizens understand ultimately what's at stake. When we're talking about these 2 options of constitutional self-government and versus a regime of central planning, that regime of central planning is a regime in which free elections stop at some point. They stop because when one of the conditions necessary for a an election to occur and to be legitimate. And when I say legitimate, intrinsically legitimate, but legitimate in the eyes of everyone participating, which includes the losers. And the losers really matter. When big problems crop up, when the losers in election don't accept the result. Now you have a problem. And it is much more likely that losers will accept the results if the results are selecting someone to go to a government whose power is constrained and restrained by a constitution. Because that means no matter who wins or loses the election, the government can't do that much to me. The more we become a progressive regime of central planning, then elections are no longer about who's going to be in this little limited government, constitutional government. It's about, we have all these programs and we want Alan to pay for it. Let's put that on the ballot. Who agrees that he should pay for our wasteful, counterproductive programs? And at some point, if we keep going down that path, at some point, patriotic, freedom-loving Americans who want to keep what they earn, keep their property, and choose how to use their own property, at some point they're going to say, I'm not participating anymore. That election, put whatever you want on the ballot. You're not enforcing it on me. I will resist. And that's when we get into revolutionary circumstances. And I'm saying we don't want that. We don't want that. It's a much better option if we can recover the authority of the Constitution, recover some semblance of limited power in our government. That makes elections more likely to be seen as legitimate. And we want to keep that tradition of free, peaceful elections and peaceful transfers of power. That's a good thing. We should never confuse it with the fact is a peaceful election followed by a peaceful transfer of power. That's a means. That's not the end. That's not the end goal. And when the end goal of government, when government starts to violate its purpose, it makes those elections, the means, much more difficult or unlikely that they're going to happen.
Tom, when you're saying that, I can't help but think what an opportunity Vino and Veritas Society has today, right? A couple days after an election that a lot of people are actually looking at and saying, this is illegitimate. From the tops of this government to my neighbors that are saying this election is not legitimate. They may not be using those words,
right,
but it's meaning the same thing. What an opportunity for Vino and Veritas, for us that understand to even the slightest degree what that really should look like. We are at a crossroads in our society where I think there's a lot of people that should be and will be looking for something just like Vino and Veritas Society that says, I don't have the means to argue about what it is that I really should be arguing about. I know I have the right of revolution, but I don't know how to get to these points before that point.
Right. Yeah.
What a great opportunity that we have as a society to take that message forward of self-governance and individual freedom and liberty we wouldn't have had a month ago.
That's right. Amen. Alan, you had something. Go ahead and jump
Well,
in.
and the other opportunity we have is to take the idea that these elections are getting scarier and scarier because when you have a balance of transfer and power to a guy that you don't agree with who now has all this progressive central planning power, people are going to get more and more scared in future upcoming elections because the power held by that person is scarier and scarier each time. We have the opportunity to step in and say, hey, if you're scared every single election, whether your guy is going to win or not, we have an answer for it.
Yes.
We have an answer so that you're not fearful every 2 years or especially every 4 years when this power that the president has, we have an answer for you that probably involves some concepts you're not going to initially agree with. But if you're scared of being scared, or
right,
if you're tired of being angry because your guy's not winning, we have an answer, and it involves these principles and these ideas. And we need to be able to step in there and start to talk about these things and take advantage of these opportunities and say, hey, we have a solution. We have a really great and wonderful solution. And luckily we had a great set of guys who thought about it prior to us who are much more learned than we were. And here's our thoughts and ideas.
Yep, I agree.
mean, I think the takeaway here, I think the takeaway, I know for me from this election, I think for the Vino Veritas Society from this election, I hope for everybody else is sit back, stop for a minute, and think about, am I putting my energy in the right direction? Have I been for the last, I don't care if it's 3 months, 3 years, 30 years, whatever, is my attention, has my effort been in the right direction? Because the truth is, we're losing. We're losing. We might get a win here and there. Colorado got a slight reduction in income tax rates this year, and that's a small win. But there were a lot of losses, and on a nationwide basis, there were a lot of losses. And I've said it before on today, we've been saying this for months. We are more progressive today than we ever have been before.
Dave, to that point, I want to emphasize here, I want to encourage our members and to have our members inspire those around them to take a long view. This problem is a chronic problem in the freedom movement, in the conservative movement, of looking no farther than the next election, maybe 2 elections. I guarantee there are conservative strategists out there right now thinking about 2024.
Right.
What they're not thinking about is 2124. 100 years from now, what would this look like? The reason progressivism, one of the reasons that it has been so amazingly successful, so terrifyingly successful, is that they had a long-term strategy. They did not think about who we're going to field for the next governorship or the next president. They said, let's build institutions of higher education that will educate people over generations. They were thinking in terms of 50, 75, 100 years, multiple generations, knowing that if we can spread our ideas over that long period of time, the elections will come. We don't even care if they call themselves Democrats or Republicans. They'll all be progressives, and they'll all be promoting our progressive agenda. And we need a large team of people who take that long-term view. The Vino Veritas Society, we founded the Vino Veritas Society with a long-term view, right? This is not a business we're looking to build up real quickly and turn around and flip and sell. This is something we want the Vino Veritas Society to be around 300 years from now,
right? When
we're all long gone, and we want this to be a national social club and organization across the country. It's the place where patriots go to remind themselves what freedom means.
To that end, one problem that conservatives, Republicans, and freedom-loving people have is we almost like to out-freedom each other. And especially with our representatives, another thing that our friend Bob Schaefer said at LPR is he said when he looked at bills, he said, is this bill going to take me in a step closer to freedom? Mm-hmm. And too many conservatives, Republicans, fill in the blank, what they do is they say, well, this bill doesn't take us back to the founding fathers' vision. Mm-hmm. So you are not a freedom-loving individual. Even though this bill would take us closer to freedom and start to turn that boat slightly, we now are cutting down our own, cutting them off at the knees and saying, well, now I'm going to vote for, I'm going to help your opponent. I'm not going to vote for you, or I'm going to make sure I no longer, fundraise for you. And we cut ourselves off at the knees because we're unwilling to take a long-term approach, and we want to do things quickly. And we want to say, no, you need to be proposing bills that just absolutely abolish everything. And we need to understand that's not going to happen. So we need to be able to propose bills and back legislators and representatives who are willing to say, you know what, this isn't my complete vision of what I want, but you know what, I'm turning the boat slightly towards it. So that maybe as I start to shift this Overton window, we need to think about shifting the Overton window, not just completely moving it to where we want it. Right. And a lot of us want to move it very quickly, and that's very understandable. But we need to be able to do the small things to change the culture and back people who are willing to do the hard things that, you know what, that bill may not be what they personally believe or the end goal of what they want, but they see it as a small incremental step towards that end.
That's a great point.
And to that end, we can keep trying to pass those little incremental bills and those little incremental policy changes. while on a larger long-term view scale, it's time to start deciding, do we want to save the Constitution or not? Because it is under attack. The ideas of the Declaration of Independence, the most beautiful ideas ever put on paper, the things that have done more for human prosperity, wealth, safety, everything else, every measurable metric you can use to determine the potential of human beings and the quality of life for human beings has improved under the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. It's time that we decide we're going to save that. It's time that we decide we're going to save that, and to do that, we have to learn about it. And so, unless anybody has anything else they want to chime in, I'd like to wrap up with sort of a call to action for everybody as they attend our chapter meetings, as they watch our videos, the toolboxes, these podcasts, everything else. When you show up at a meeting, when you talk to a fellow guardian or Poor Richard or digital subscriber of the Vino Veritas Society, stop thinking so much about the immediate policy and start coming with a mindset on what is the Constitution, what did the Founding Fathers intend, what was the meaning, what does the Federalist Papers say, what does the Declaration say, and how do we get closer to that? And if we can start coming in with that attitude, with that perspective, we can make a whole lot more of a difference than if we come in and we want to interrupt these conversations with, yeah, but that paid family medical leave, that was so bad, I need to spend the next 35 minutes talking about that. Because at this point, we're going to keep losing those votes every single time we do this until we start thinking and start convincing more Americans to believe in the ideas of the Declaration of Independence.
I think that's absolutely right.
Anything else on that?
I'll just add here a bad analogy. And that is to think about this in a way that's similar to religion. Similar. It's not exactly the same. But the point is, if you're evangelizing, if you're recruiting someone to your church, do you start with some theological detail or some particular part of the ceremony and right with it? Or do you start with the big general idea, what your church, what your religion stands for? You start with the big general idea. Once someone says, well, I agree with that big general idea. Okay, then you can work into the theological details, right? Same thing here. Do you like the big general American idea? The American idea of liberty, that you have a right to your liberty? Do you like that? Or do you hate it? If you hate it, there's a whole bunch of progressives over there for you to join. If you appreciate that, come in, you're welcome. Let's talk about it and explore more what that means.
And everybody needs to understand both sides of this too, right? We do the progressive toolbox and the New Deal toolbox, and there'll be more of those because you need to understand what the root of those ideas are and where they're trying to go. So I really hope, if nothing else, that this election gets everybody to sit back and think, I need to better understand all these documents. I need to better understand all of these ideas. And I'm ready to go out there and start making an argument to defend them and to go on offense against the morally bankrupt ideas of the progressive movement. And with that, that's why we're the guardians. That's why we say no sumus custodes.
No sumus custodes.
Thanks, guys, and we'll see you again next week.